The story of this earthquake is written in concrete. Across western Colombia, in city after city, the same thing happened in an instant on Monday morning. Buildings came down. A bell tower on a century-old cathedral sheared clean off and crashed into the street below. A wing of a major hospital gave way, forcing more than 600 patients out into the open air. A school partially collapsed with children inside it. Apartment blocks folded, floor onto floor. In a Pacific port city, a building fell and trapped the people inside. By the time the shaking stopped, dozens of structures across the country had collapsed completely and thousands more were cracked, leaning, and unsafe to enter. This was a disaster of the built environment, a catastrophe made not only of geology but of concrete and steel and brick, of what we build and how, and it raises the question that haunts every earthquake like this one. Why? Why did these particular buildings come down? Why, on the very same street, did one building crumble into rubble while the one right beside it stood almost untouched? The answers are not random. They are written into the engineering, into the soil, into the age and the design of every structure that faced that shaking. And understanding them is the difference between a city that survives the next earthquake and a city that does not. This is the story of the buildings that fell in Colombia. Where, why, and what it tells us about the ground so many of us live on. Start with the scale of it because it is staggering. According to Colombia's Association of Capital Cities, at least 86 buildings across the country collapsed outright. Not merely damaged, but brought fully to the ground. 5 cities were singled out as suffering the most severe impacts: Pereira, Cali, Quibdó, Manizales, and Armenia. And in Cali alone, Colombia's third largest city, the numbers tell a devastating story. More than 5,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed there. 40 of them collapsed. 18 hospitals sustained damage. In one neighborhood, an entire building came down completely. Across the region, the same magnitude 7.4 earthquake, striking from about 100 kilometers below the surface, had reached up and found the weakest structures in every city it touched and pulled them down. Behind those numbers are hundreds of dead and thousands injured, with the toll still provisional and still climbing as this is told. Officials have counted the dead in the hundreds, by some tallies more than 200, by others higher still, and the figures keep rising as rescuers reach deeper into the rubble and into communities they had not yet been able to access. Every one of those collapses was a place where people lived, worked, healed, or learned. To understand the disaster, you have to understand what happened to those buildings. Let's begin on the coast in Buenaventura, because the title of this disaster runs all the way to the Pacific. Buenaventura is Colombia's main Pacific port, the country's most important maritime gateway, the place through which an enormous share of the nation's trade flows in and out. It is also a city that has long struggled with poverty and underinvestment, where infrastructure is more fragile than in the wealthier cities of the interior. When the earthquake struck, a building in Buenaventura collapsed, killing one person and trapping several others beneath it, according to the city's mayor. And the port itself, the beating economic heart of the city, was thrown into immediate crisis. But here the story takes an important turn, and it's a lesson in itself. The port's major terminals by and large held, operators activated emergency protocols within minutes, carried out precautionary evacuations, and sent engineers to inspect every crane, dock, and structure. One large container terminal suspended operations entirely while it awaited a full safety clearance. Another was soon handling ships more or less normally after inspections. Others began a careful, phased recovery. Crucially, the country's maritime authority confirmed there was no tsunami threat to the Pacific coast. The port's heavy, modern engineered infrastructure, designed and built to demanding standards, mostly withstood a shaking that flattened older, weaker buildings elsewhere. That contrast is not a coincidence. It is the entire point, and we'll come back to it. Yet even a port that survives the shaking can be paralyzed by what happens around it. The roads linking Buenaventura to the interior of the country, the arteries that carry cargo between the Pacific and Colombia's cities, were damaged and blocked. Along the highway between Cali and Buenaventura, rock slides trapped more than a dozen vehicles inside a tunnel, sealing the exit toward Cali. A port can be structurally sound and still be cut off, its goods unable to move, if the roads that feed it are severed. And so Buenaventura became a snapshot of the whole disaster in miniature. Some structures standing, some falling, and the connections between them broken. And the stakes there reach far beyond the city limits. Buenaventura handles a very large share of everything Colombia imports and exports. The goods that stock its shelves, the coffee and other products it sends out to the world. When that gateway slows, the disruption ripples across the entire national economy, felt in prices and shortages hundreds of miles from the coast. Behind the machinery, too, are the people of a working port city, dock workers, drivers, families, in a community that has historically received less investment and protection than the wealthier interior, and that now faces the shaking with fewer resources to recover. It is a reminder that a disaster is never only about the buildings that fall in the moment, it is also about who was already vulnerable when the ground began to move, and who has the least cushion to absorb the blow. Now move inland, to the coffee region, where the earthquake found some of its highest death tolls. In Pereira, a city of more than 500,000 people, the destruction was severe, and by some counts, Pereira suffered more deaths than any other city. Buildings collapsed, the power failed across much of the city. And in Manizales, the image that traveled around the world was of the historic neo-Gothic cathedral, one of its two great bell towers sheared away and sent crashing into the plaza below. The city's mayor reported that around 60 buildings had totally or partially collapsed, and that the city had received thousands of requests from frightened residents to have their homes inspected, a task, he warned, that would take a month or more. In Armenia, the city that carries more than any other the memory of the coffee region's last great earthquake in 1999, buildings were evacuated as engineers feared they might come down, and people gathered in the open, unwilling to trust the walls around them. So we return to the central question. Why do buildings fall in an earthquake at all? And the answer begins with a hard truth that seismologists and engineers repeat after every disaster like this one. Earthquakes on their own almost never kill people directly. Buildings do. The shaking itself is survivable. A person standing in an open field during even a violent earthquake is in relatively little danger. The danger is what the shaking brings down on top of people, the walls, the floors, the roofs. And that means the death toll of an earthquake is decided more than by almost anything else by the quality of the buildings it strikes. This is why the very same magnitude of earthquake can kill a handful of people in one country and many thousands in another. The difference is not the geology, it is the construction. So what exactly makes a building fall? The physics is both simple and unforgiving. When the ground shakes, a building sways, and every building has a natural rhythm, a frequency at which it wants to sway, determined by its height and its structure. Here is the danger. If the shaking of the ground happens to match a building's natural rhythm, the sway doesn't just continue, it amplifies, building on itself with each cycle, exactly like a child being pushed on a swing at just the right moment, going higher and higher. This is called resonance, and it can shake a building apart from the inside. It is also why an earthquake can be selective. Shaking of a certain frequency may leave a tall tower standing while it destroys the mid-rise buildings whose natural rhythm it happens to match. Then there is the way buildings are put together. One of the most common and deadly failures is what engineers call a soft story collapse. Picture a building whose ground floor is mostly open, wide windows, a parking area, shop fronts, few solid walls, sitting beneath heavy, more solid floors above. When the shaking hits, that weak, open ground floor cannot resist the sideways forces, and it buckles and gives way, letting the entire weight of the building above slam straight down. The upper floors pancake, stacking one on top of another with almost no space left between them. It is one of the most lethal ways a building can fail, and one of the very hardest for rescuers to search because the survivable gaps simply vanish. Another killer is unreinforced masonry, walls of brick, block, or stone with no steel inside to hold them together. Masonry is strong when you push down on it, but brittle and weak when you shove it sideways, and an earthquake shoves sideways. Without reinforcing steel, those walls simply crack and shatter and fall. That heavy old cathedral tower in Manizales, built of centuries-old stone, was exactly the kind of construction most vulnerable to being thrown down by seismic shaking. The way a building fails also decides how many people can be pulled from it alive, which is why these distinctions are not merely academic. When a building pancakes, floor slamming flat onto floor, it leaves almost no survivable space inside, and rescuers may have to cut and tunnel through solid layers of concrete just to reach a single void. When a wall or a facade fails but the frame holds, there is far more chance of finding pockets where people survived. This is the brutal reality rescue teams are navigating across Colombia right now. Racing against the clock, aid agencies generally consider the first 2 to 3 days the most critical window to find survivors alive, though it can stretch longer if trapped people have air and water. The type of collapse a building suffered on Monday morning is, in a very real sense, still deciding who can be saved from it today. And underneath all of this lies the ground itself. When seismic waves pass from hard bedrock into the soft, loose soils that fill many valley floors and coastal plains, something dangerous happens. The soft ground can trap and amplify the shaking, making the surface tremble harder, and for longer, than the solid rock beneath would. A building on soft soil can be shaken far more violently than an identical building on firm ground a short distance away. Colombia's coffee region is a landscape of steep Andean valleys, and cities like Cali sit on exactly the kinds of soils that can magnify an earthquake's punch. The very same quake, then, does not deliver the same blow everywhere. It is amplified here, muted there, which is part of why the destruction was so uneven, so maddeningly building by building. Now put it all together and you can finally answer the haunting question from the start. Why did one building fall while its neighbor stood? Because that neighbor was in some crucial way different. Perhaps it was newer, built to a modern seismic code that required it to flex and hold together rather than shatter. Perhaps it had steel reinforcement or a strong, continuous ground floor, or a shape and height whose natural rhythm did not match the shaking. Perhaps it sat on firmer soil. Perhaps it had been retrofitted, braced and strengthened against exactly this kind of event. And perhaps the building that fell was older, weaker, built before modern codes or outside of them, of unreinforced masonry on soft ground, with a vulnerable open ground floor. Two buildings side by side facing the identical earthquake EQ, and one becomes a tomb while the other becomes a shelter. The difference between them was decided long before the earthquake ever came, in the choices of how each one was designed and built. Colombia, to its credit, knows this lesson well. It was written in blood once before. After the 1999 earthquake devastated the coffee region, the country moved to strengthen its seismic building codes, requiring new construction to be engineered to withstand strong shaking. On paper, Colombia has some of the more rigorous building standards in the region. But a building code only protects the people inside a building if it is actually followed and enforced. In many places, older structures went up long before those modern rules existed and were never brought up to standard. And a great deal of construction, especially in poorer neighborhoods and informal settlements, happens outside the formal system entirely, self-built, without engineers, without inspections, without the reinforcement the code would demand. The result is that within a single city you can find buildings that would ride out almost any earthquake standing right next to buildings that never had a chance. The gap between the code on paper and the buildings actually standing on the ground is, quite literally, a matter of life and death. And earthquakes are the merciless test that reveals exactly where that gap lies. This is what makes the cruelest collapses of this disaster so hard to bear, because some of the buildings that failed were the very ones meant to keep people safe. In Cali, a section of the upper floors of a major hospital collapsed, and more than 600 patients, people who were already sick or injured, already at their most vulnerable, had to be rushed out of the building and treated out in the open. 18 hospitals in that one city alone were damaged. Think about what that means in the middle of a disaster. The places that are supposed to receive and heal the wounded were themselves wounded, their capacity slashed at the exact moment the need for them exploded. And in the town of Calima, a school partially collapsed and 4 children were killed, with dozens more injured. There are few things harder to absorb than that, a place built to hold and teach children brought down on top of them. These are the collapses that turn an engineering problem into a moral one, that show why building safely is not a technicality but a matter of life and death, especially for hospitals and schools, the buildings of society most needs to keep standing. It's worth pausing here on one piece of grim good fortune, because it explains why the toll, as terrible as it is, was not even higher. This earthquake was deep. It ruptured roughly 100 kilometers below the surface, far beneath the thin crust rather than in the shallow zone where the most city-destroying quakes occur. A rupture from that depth sends its energy spreading through an enormous volume of rock before it reaches the surface, which is why the shaking was felt across an astonishing sweep of territory through 9 departments in every one of the country's 32 departmental capitals and across the borders into Ecuador and toward Venezuela. But that same depth also spread the energy thin, so that a magnitude 7.4 Da, a size that would have been apocalyptic if it had struck at shallow depth directly beneath a city, did not level these cities entirely. If the same earthquake had ruptured near the surface beneath Cali or Pereira, the number of buildings down and the number of lives lost could have been vastly, unthinkably greater. The depth was, in a dark sense, the region's fragile mercy. The buildings that fell were the weakest ones. Had the quake been shallow, even the strong ones might not have been enough. Which brings us to what comes next, because a disaster of the built environment does not end when the shaking stops. It begins a reckoning that will last for months and years. Right now, across every affected city, engineers face the enormous task of inspecting tens of thousands of damaged buildings one by one to decide which are safe to re-enter, which must be repaired, and which must be torn down. In Manizales alone, the requests for inspection number in the thousands, and officials have said plainly it will take a month or far longer just to work through them. Families cannot go home until their homes are cleared. Businesses cannot reopen. Hospitals must be repaired or replaced while somehow continuing to treat the injured. The port must fully restore its operations and reopen the roads that connect it to the country, because a nation's economy runs through places like Buenaventura, and every day of disruption ripples outward. And through all of it runs the hardest question of all. When these cities rebuild, will they rebuild stronger? Will the new construction be engineered to survive the next earthquake, because there will be a next earthquake? Or will the same vulnerabilities be poured back into the same soft ground, setting the stage for the same tragedy to repeat? Because that is the real lesson, written in the rubble of Colombia. The fault deep beneath the earth is beyond our control. It will keep moving for as long as the continents keep colliding, which is to say forever. But the buildings are ours, how they are designed, what they are made of, where they are placed, and how honestly the codes that govern them are enforced, those are human choices. And those choices, more than the raw power of any earthquake, decide who lives and who dies when the ground finally shakes. The earthquake exposed the weak structures. The recovery is a chance to replace them with strong ones. Whether Colombia and every earthquake-prone place like it takes that chance is a decision measured ultimately in lives. For now, the search goes on, the damaged cities hold their breath, and a nation begins the long work of clearing what fell and grieving those it could not save. Buildings can be rebuilt. The people lost beneath them cannot. And that is precisely why how we build matters so much. Because in the end, a building is not just concrete and steel. It is a promise that the walls around you will hold. If this helped you understand what really brought these buildings down and why the ones that stood akun, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. If you have family or friends in Pereira, Armenia, Buenaventura, or anywhere across the affected region, tell us what you're seeing and hearing. This community is following it closely, and our thoughts are with everyone caught up in this disaster. And if you want to keep understanding the forces that shape our world and the ways we can build to withstand them, make sure you're subscribed. Stay aware, stay safe, and take care of one another.